I have a couple of administrative things I'd like to cover before we get started. And the first is that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the PVRC webpage. That's www.pvrc.org, and that'll be under the recorded webinars link. So you can watch it again, or if anyone missed it, let them know and they can see the presentation. Hopefully you've had a chance to review the attendee quick reference guide posted on the PVRC webpage if you're new to this forum. I think we've got a lot of repeat people here, so you pretty much know how this works. But for anyone new, let me just mention that you can go ahead and play with the attendee application during the presentation. It will not affect the presentation. You're not going to crash anything, or at least not for the rest of the participants. And what you're doing just affects your own PC, so feel free to experiment and play around with it if you'd like to. All attendees are muted in order to cut down on background noise, and only the host, which is me, can unmute you. That is if you do have a microphone connected to your PC. Questions will be held until the end of the presentation in order to maintain the flow, and your options for submitted questions are either the questions box, where you can type that in and hit send, and I will pick those up and read them off to Gene and he can answer. Or if you do have a microphone connected and you'd like to talk directly to us, on one of your grab tabs, your control panel, you have a little hand icon, and what you can do is click on that, and that'll raise your hand as if you're sitting in a classroom. I'll go ahead and call on you, unmute your microphone, and you can go ahead and ask your question. And again, we'll try to hold those until the end. I should also mention, if you do submit a question during the presentation, please put your call sign at the end of your question, so we have your call sign to go along with it. As I mentioned, we are pleased to have Gene Zimmerman W3ZZ joining us. Gene is, of course, well known throughout the ranks of contesting, and he currently serves as editor of QST's The World Above 50 Megahertz column, a role he took over in December of 2002. VHF and above has been an interest of mine since I was first licensed in 1956, says Gene. On the HF side, Gene has logged several national top 10 finishes in the ARRL November sweepstakes, both modes, as well as the second place North American finish in CQ Worldwide CW from Victor Papa 2, Mike Delta Delta, and held the World Multi-Multi record as a member of PJ0DX and PJ0 Charlie Whiskey. Those were multi-multi teams. He's also achieved several national top 10 finishes in ARRL VHF parties and in the ARRL VHF sweepstakes. Gene is a founding member of the KGP Grid Pirates and past president and member of the board of directors of PVRC. He also holds VUCC on 50 through 1296 megahertz. A life member of ARRL, Gene has served on the ARRL Contest Advisory Committee, edited the VHF Contesting column for CQ Contest magazine during its 5-year lifespan, and was director from 2000 until 2002 of the CQ VHF Contest. Gene is also a member of the CQ Worldwide DX Contest Committee. Gene, appreciate you taking the time to join us this evening. The floor is yours. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Ken. I'd like to talk to you all tonight about VHF contesting. It's an interesting pursuit, and one where you can do awfully well, a lot more easily than you can do awfully well in an HF contest. This presentation is modeled after one that I gave to the Contest University at the Dayton Hamvention in May 2008. If you heard that and you stayed awake, you may not hear too much that's new, except some of the equipment's gotten a little bit better in the last 2 years, but the antennas haven't changed very much. I'm going to talk really about 2 things here. First is station siting. In other words, just what the people who sell houses realtors will tell you it's location, location, location. If you don't have the right location, you can have fun, but you're wasting your time if you think you're going to win. And the hardware inside and outside that location that you use to compete in the contest. And then I want to talk about the various types of operating techniques. The standard things that you do in every contest, the specialized things that pertain mainly to VHF, and digital. VHF contests are unusual in that they mix digital and analog modes. So think of a sideband contest that also has an RTTY segment, and you really have to operate RTTY or you'll lose the sideband contest. Now, when I announced that I would do this, everyone said, oh, I want to hear this because I want to hear about all the secrets about winning the contest. Look at the first bullet. There are no secrets. If you want to win any contest, whether it's a VHF or HF contest, it depends on physically where you are and where you are compared to everybody else, the geography. You are not going to win a VHF contest if you live in western North Dakota. But stations from non-populous areas can and do win VHF contests. Something that you can't say for like an ARLDX contest. They're all in New England or down here in the Mid-Atlantic. If you live in Illinois or you live in Texas, maybe once every 10 years you have a shot if you live in Texas, but only if you live along the coast. If you're inland in Dallas, you could spend $10 million on your station. You aren't going to win. And the examples, I'll give you 3 examples of people who are nowhere near any centers of population. W5ZN, who just recently stepped down as the ARRL president, has won this contest in June. He has a big station, he's a good operator, and he has lots of microwave capabilities. WA8WZG, for many years, was the winner. It would be interesting if he were to come back and see whether he could beat K1TEO. He might just do it. That is a monstrous microwave station. I live 400 miles from him. He's in northwestern Ohio, essentially in the suburbs of Detroit. And he wins this. Every Q is 400 miles away for him. K5QE is a multi-multi, rather recent vintage. It's also a big station, but it's on the Louisiana-Texas border, far enough inland that the oil won't get him. But he has to work really hard because he has no locals. It isn't a question of every Q is 400 miles away. Even when he goes 400 miles, there isn't an awful lot to work. I'm not going to talk very much about this slide, just to tell you the different types of competition you can have. We're going to talk about single operator high power in a way that doesn't exist. There aren't any people who have a station like the one I'll describe at the end of this talk. But there ought to be, because it's not that expensive and it's not that hard to do. It's a lot harder to build a competitive HF station. LM is limited multi. That's the bottom 4 bands, 50, 144, 222, and 432. Multi-multi is the unlimited class. K3LR, W3LPL, KC1XX. And there are 3 classes of rover. I won't go into why that's the case, but that's what it is now. There are regular old rovers. There are unlimited rovers who normally operate in large packs and spend essentially 95% or more of their time working each other as they drive from place to place. And there are limited rovers that can operate any 4 bands. VHF contests have specific characteristics. It's a zero-sum game. Think 40-meter phone in a DX contest before the broadcast stations went away and you could work people on your own frequency. You ought to work everyone who shows up. Because there are only a limited number of people, you need to work them on every band they have. So you constantly pass them from band to band. When you have rovers who are operating physically close enough to you geographically that you can work them, you have to be aware of their routes and their times in a particular grid. You don't want to miss them. They're like a little de-expedition, 3 or 4, 5, 10 times in a contest. You can either call CQ or you can search and pounce. We'll talk about that later. Between midnight and 7 a.m., VHF guys normally go to sleep. There are other things you can do which are very productive. But standard sideband or even CW, there's not much of it. You have to be aware of the other guy's environment. Just because you live on a mountaintop and it's quiet and you hear somebody and you call them and they don't come back to you and you say, I wonder why that is. You know, my local power company has declared an extra dividend, will declare an extra dividend on Monday morning after this contest, and this guy can't hear me. Well, maybe his location is noisy. Or maybe his receiver is deaf as it can be. Maybe he's stupid. You never know. And you can't do anything about any of these except make your station as good as you can make it. Finally, although you don't get them very often, if there is a band opening, you don't want to miss it, particularly when there's E-skip on 6 meters. You want to be on 6 meters, not anyplace else. What about the location that you get? It's not clear which of these first 2 bullets is the most important. You need a quiet location, real quiet, as quiet as you can get it. No matter how good your noise blankers are, your digital noise limiters, they aren't going to be good enough compared with a location that has no noise to start with. In the directions where there's high activity, for instance, around here, for what you would call ground wave, it's actually troposcatter, you want to be clear up at a heading of about 60 degrees, up towards eastern Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and New England. And you also want to have a fairly low takeoff angle in the directions from here, which is mainly to the west and southwest, where there's E-skip. That's 180 to 300 degrees. Each location is different where you want to be. If you live due south 75 miles of Chicago, you want to be able to see Chicago. You want to be above the trees. It's less important on 6, and it won't be a deal breaker on 2. But once you get to 220, it starts to hurt. And once you get to 432 and above, it really hurts. On the microwaves, if you're not clear of the trees, you're going to suck wind big time. What if you don't have all this? You still want to do VHF? Either go to a portable location on a big hilltop or a mountain, or become a rover. I assume everybody knows what a rover is. That's a station that goes from one location to another during the contest, sets up in different grids, and he basically can work everybody over again when he shifts locations if he goes to a new grid. All right, let's talk about the inside of the station. The receivers have to deal with 2 very opposite problems. Most of the signals you work are really, really weak. And I mean really weak. A lot weaker than you'll ever run into in an HF contest. And the locals are enormously strong. Millivolts worth of signal is going in your front end. So if you don't have a receiver that is both sensitive and can handle big signals, you're going to get blown away. And people are going to complain. If you have big antennas and a lot of power, they're going to say, gee, you're as broad as a barn. Then you ask them what they're using. And they tell you, and you know that's a receiver that has a 65 dB front end, and it's deaf as a stone. It's lucky it has a 10 dB noise figure. Well, you can't do anything for those folks. They're just going to have to suffer. You don't have much QRM. Only really on 6 meters do you have QRM. And even then, the QRM is like 10 meters, not like 20 meters in the afternoon when the Europeans are S0. The W's are 75 dB over S9, and smoke is pouring out of your front end. And you've got to run those Europeans at 100 an hour, or you're going to lose the contest. Finally, you have to have a decent design. Low phase noise. And it'd be nice, I say here, for the receiver to have low phase noise. It'd be nice if your transmitter had low phase noise. There's not much you can do when somebody has a rotten transmitter. For a transmitter, you've got to have enough radiated power to be heard. That's the problem. Not getting through a pileup, but being heard at all. There are really very few pileups. Amplifiers tend to be these bricks with heat sinks on top of them. They run 100 to 150 watts. Going above that in power gets to be a bit pricey. And there's no Alpha 87 that runs 4 bands. They're all single band amplifiers for the most part. The antennas tend to be single band. There are no multi-band antennas. I've talked about that in my column. It would be nice if someone offered one at a reasonable price that would cover 6.2 and 432, the 3 most popular bands, in one structure. And it can be done, but it's not cheap, and the few that have appeared over the years don't sell, so the manufacturers don't produce them. These antennas have very sharp patterns and essentially no side lobes. You will never see an HF antenna with a pattern like these, VHF antennas, particularly at 2 meters and above. They're like a searchlight. They're narrow, they're 30 degrees wide, and if somebody calls you and is 60 degrees off your heading, you don't hear him, even if he's only 15, 20 miles away. Ground gain doesn't matter, except on 6 meters, because nothing is to speak of is ionospheric. And the antennas tend to be many wavelengths high. And you want good feed lines. No, you can't use RG8X. No, you can't use RG58. And no, you probably shouldn't use RG213 either. At the very least, you should have the foam-filled coaxes like 9913 F7 from Belden, or LMR 400 UF, and a lot of people use hardline. Hardline's very expensive if you buy it new, but there's plenty of it around surplus. And unless it's been badly mistreated, like it's been sitting in a vat of water for the last 22 years, it's not going to go bad anytime soon. You want to make sure your antennas are modern designs. By that I mean they were designed on a computer. If they were designed on a computer by somebody who knows what he's doing, and essentially all of the manufacturers do know, they'll work very well. But if you get an old design that wasn't computer modeled, like an old Cushcraft, like a 50-5 or 50-6 without the letter S after it, that's not computerized. And that's like a rotary dummy load. It's like a TA-33, Suckermaster rotary dummy load. It has a gain of about -5 dB compared to a dipole, but it does have a pattern. Makes you think something's happening, but it isn't. You want to look at it and say, is this antenna going to hold up in my weather conditions? That means if you get 2-inch radial ice a couple of times a year, is it going to fold up like a tent or not? You want an antenna of reasonable size, but not too long. You'll see my antenna system in a minute. It tends to be too long. I'm constantly moving the antenna around. And that's because my home station is a DXing station. When I want to do contests, I go out in the field with a portable. And we tend not to have long antennas. They tend to be shorter, or at least there's plenty of short ones that are broad off the front. I talked about the feed lines above, on 432 and above, 1/2 inch, 7/8 inch heliacs, or the hard lines like RG 333 and 331 are really what you want. You want low loss. And since you've got to have a lot of bands if you want to be competitive, you tend to stack these antennas. I talked about that, I think, not this January, but maybe it was the January before in the column, how you stack the similar bands. The good news is you can practically stack them right on top of one another, and they interfere a little bit with their vertical patterns. But you don't care about that unless you're doing EME, in which case you can't put more than one band on a tower very effectively. There's my antennas. This isn't a brand new picture because you'll see over here, let me see if I can find here, you'll see these are loop Yagis. On this side, the loop Yagis, this is an 18-foot 47 element 903 pair, and on the other side, here's 1296 loop Yagis. This is a midget tribander, a 14-foot Explorer, which does pretty well. Anything that's 83 feet high and reasonably in the clear, although see, the trees are starting to encroach on me a little bit. Here's a 6-meter beam. Here's a 2-meter beam. Here, as usual, a little bit off center. It's off by about 5 or 10 degrees, and I have to remember that when I point it. It's a 33 element 432, and at the tippity top at 107 feet, this mast that I have, you'll see there's a rotator here, there's a drive pipe, there's a big piece of channel with 8 enormous U-bolts, and there's a 24-foot quarter-inch wall 6061 ST piece of aluminum pipe, actually tubing, and all of this stuff is stacked on there. In amongst the loop Yagis now I have a couple of blow torches, which are really long loop Yagis for 2304 and 3456, and a small 2-foot 2-band dish. So that's what you do if you've got one support. Yes, it's a lot of crap on one tower, but it works pretty well. It has finished in the top 10 several times. This last January, I think I finished 14th. I shouldn't have watched the football games. I could have probably made it into the top 10. but I would rather watch football games. Conditions pretty bad in January. And now you have to put it all together. Instant band changing. Well, that's easy to say on HF, not so easy on VHF. You have to select transverters because you can buy you can get 6 meters integrated into your HF transceiver, but above that point, you do it usually with transverters. You have to be able to switch your amplifiers. You have to distribute audio from as many receivers as you had. You'll see the ideal station, I think, should have 3 receivers. You have to distribute your key lines. You have to distribute your microphone. You have to be able to do digital. Digital is weak signal by K1JT. There it is. And this is a very elegant 4-tone system that allows you to hear signals that are up to 10 dB below the noise. Very clever. And finally, if you're going to have really good receivers on the higher bands, I'd say from 432 and up, you should have remote preamps. Since they're in the line, the transmit line, you have to take them in and out with relays. You have to sequence them. They have to go away before you transmit and come back after you finish transmitting. And if you don't sequence them right, terrible things happen inside the preamps. Like you wind up seeing something with a few legs sticking up and the body is gone. So, what about the strategies? The level of competition is actually quite reasonable. The current winners, the guys in the top 10, have stations that are the equivalent of an HF little pistol. There isn't a single op high-powered station that's really good. There are a couple that are good on some bands, but not on the 10 or 11 bands that you need. It's unnecessary. They're doing well as it is, so they don't have it. And you should distribute your contest effort depending on where you live, because E-skip stations far from the Northeast can win the January VHF, or rather the June VHF party, and the CQ Worldwide, which is in July. Non-Northeastern stations with enhanced tropo occasionally win the September VHF party. Certainly there was a group down in North Carolina that won it in the 80s. And they're so far away, they're not so easy to work on a dead band even from up here. In January, however, the conditions are essentially guaranteed to be dreadful, and they can really be dreadful. There's been an ice storm north of here, or even here. There was in '99. Nobody got on the air because their matches were all covered with ice. Nobody could work anything. Antennas didn't work. So what do? Well, obviously you call CQ on the 2 bands where you can work random people. That's 6 and 2 meters. And you alternate. You can't transmit on 2 bands at once, but you can go between the 2 bands rather well. The rates are pretty low by HF standards, but you work 100 guys on 6 meters. Well, that's pretty exciting. You'll have to hustle to do that. Every station that you work, you have to get to know where they are and what they have, and you move them to all the bands they have. And that's more important than establishing a run frequency, except for 6 meters. If the bands are not enhanced, it's more important to get them on a microwave band when you hear them. The problem is, if you don't do it now, you may never hear them again. Yes, it'd be nice to know their calls. I do. I sometimes know their voices. I don't even have to hear their calls. It helps me locate them and point my antenna at them. But you'll learn eventually, just like you learned on HF. You need to keep track of the rovers, like these little mini DXpeditions. They provide you both multipliers and contacts. Often the rovers will tell you what route they're going to take and approximately when they'll be there. Of course, they can't be accurately know in real time, but it's close enough. The scoring in contests, if you want to compete for the top, disproportionately favors microwave contacts. So you have to work everybody that you can on every microwave band they have. That means you need a really big microwave station. That's the bad news. The good news is that you don't have to build it anymore. You can buy the pieces. You can get power by buying surplus stuff, and it actually works. I have, for instance, 60 watts on 2304 with a commercial module out of a thing called a Spectrian, and 40 watts on 3456 with a Toshiba. If I had to build this, I'd be clueless. But you can make it work. You need to be able to point your antennas accurately. That means that you have to have them set up so that north is really north, and it's true north and not magnetic north. You have to know the difference. And you should have a digital readout. You don't have to have that, but it sure helps, especially on the upper bands. You should know what frequency you're on. That's also not cheap, but it's doable. And you can sometimes see things before you hear them by using pan adapters. We'll talk about that later. You should also know that most microwave operators don't have a clue what frequency they're on. So just because you tell them, go to 1296.120, you can expect them maybe to show up on 120, maybe to show up on 145. There's one well-known large microwave competitor that is usually off by 50 kilohertz. That's the good news, is that you know that. The bad news is one year he's 50 high and the next year he's 50 low. So you got to tune. Between 12 midnight and 7 in the morning, nothing happens. They all go to bed, even though at dawn is the best possible tropo. Doesn't matter. They still sleep. Between 3 and 6 in the morning, absolutely nothing happens unless you know there's a rover who isn't wound too tight. I shouldn't say that. Most rovers aren't wound too tight. They wouldn't be rovers otherwise, serious rovers. But we've had guys who go over to the eastern shore of Maryland and Virginia, and they only operate a very rare grid that won't otherwise be on. And you got to be there at 3 in the morning or else you're going to miss them. So what do you do during that time? Well, you can sleep. But a lot of people make digital meteor scatter schedules. Schedules is the anathema for an HF guy. But you tell me when the signal is only there for a fraction of a second at a time, and it has to be tuned dead accurately, or it won't decode. You tell me how you do that without schedules. There are some tricks you can play. We've tried it from KHEP. We haven't been very successful. We've been quite successful with schedules, but not with non-schedules. If the moon is favorable, you can work EME. You can use another form of WSJT called JT65. And there's a program called MAP65. That's if you have a cross-polarized Yagi, vertical horizontal elements on the same boom, or MAP65 IQ if it's a linearly polarized, like just the horizontal antennas. If you've got that, it's like a CW skimmer on steroids. It'll put up a picture of the band. It'll go around in an SDR. It'll copy every single JT65 signal that's on. It'll tag it like an aircraft controller's screen and say, this is W3ZZ and this is DL9KR, and et cetera, and so forth and so on. Please, the two Europeans, I shouldn't have said DL9KR since he doesn't work JT65, but any one of the EA6VQ I think does. And you click on the dot with the guy's call, it brings up the program, and if you say go, you push the go button, starts to work the guy. It's great stuff. Finally, something that's true in every contest, BIC. You all know what that means. Butt in the chair. VHF contests, the big ones, sponsored by the ARRL, are only 33 hours long. You can sleep after the contest. What about digital? It's beyond what we can really talk about here, but you've got to learn about this. And it's WSJT stands for Weak Signal by Joe Taylor, K1JT, who derived the program. It's a 4-tone frequency shift keyer. It can hear 10 dB into the noise, and there are two different versions of it. One optimized for very weak signals that last for a very short period of time. That's FSK 441. And one for just very weak signals, but they're always there. And that's digital EME. And those are three different flavors of JT65. A, B, and C, as you go down from A to C, the sensitivity drops, but the requirement for stability also goes down. VHF guys don't do SO2R. It's a shame because it's so slow. It's easy to do. It's hard to get one switch operation. You can do it. I've told you two ways of doing it. One was described in a two-part article in my column called the MOASU. That's the mother of all switching units. The other is a universal control board designed by KM0T. There are other ways too, but these are two examples. Serious VHF contesters probably should use SO3R. They should have one radio dedicated to 6, one dedicated to 2, one dedicated to everything else. Things are so slow that you almost could call CQ, like in June when there's E-skip, the whole time, 33 hours on 6 meters, and work everything else you need to work on the second radio in your spare time. And how do you do this? Probably with some form of spatial audio. We know how to do it for 2. I think it's doable for 3. You know, 2 meters in the left ear, 6 meters in the right ear, and 222 and above in the center of your head by mixing. So here's a station that would be an ideal single-op high-powered station. You're never going to see this, but this is the kind of thing that you really need. I've designed these around Elecras. I like them. They're small, they're blow-away proof, they're extremely versatile, they have very good noise blankers, actually both digital and a regular noise blanker, because they have bulletproof roofing filters. When you turn on the noise blanker, instead of being wiped out by somebody 10 kilohertz away who's loud, you don't even know he's there. In fact, a K3 can handle 100 millivolts of signal. It'll moan pretty loud, but 3 kilohertz away, you will be able to copy a weak signal. You'll know that the loud signal's there, but you'll copy the weak one too. So you have one aircraft driving a maximum power amplifier on 6. The second one I show here has a down east microwave. That's what DEMI is. 50-watt high-powered transverter driving a 1.5 kilowatt amplifier. My station doesn't do that anymore. I put the internal aircraft 10-watt unit in there, and I have a homebrew 60-watt driver that uses I think it's a Toshiba brick, and works very well. On 222, that's 1.25 meters. Same thing, another high-powered DEMI transverter and a maximum power amplifier, and the same thing on 70 centimeters. Above 70 centimeters, now you have to get, it's actually cheaper, but you got to know, you have to learn what's available. I use down east microwave transverters for, by example, up through 1296. On 903, that's 33 centimeters. There are a lot of these Motorola solid-state amplifiers that have been taken out of service. They'll put out 400 watts. At KHEP, we have something that was apparently built by PowerWave. It's a Class A amplifier that puts out 500 watts, and in fact, we don't do it, but we could power combine a pair of these and get a kilowatt output. But nobody really wants to do it. Besides which, it's like standing in front of an open microwave oven. Nobody likes the idea. And 23 centimeters, this is probably the biggest money outlay. I think it's a couple $1,000s for that solid-state DB6NT final. There just isn't any commercial stuff on that band. You can, however, there's a homebrew thing that the W6, I think PQL, has that you could probably build for about $250. The German 180-watt amplifiers, like the one I have, new, you're pushing $1,000 with those. So there's no cheap way to get power on 23 centimeters. There are some less elegant ways, like water-cooled tubes that are being run at 10 times their ratings because they're cheap, and you can water cool them. They were designed for water cooling. You can get a lot out of them, but you only have to see one of those, the water get contaminated once and one of those blow up. You only need to see that once when you wish that you weren't doing it. The rest of the bands I put in a box on top of the tower. And you can see what's here. These are all commercial finals, the Spectrian, the Toshiba, and the Avantec. Usually you can find those on eBay. They're not terribly. I think the Toshiba is like $150. It requires 1 milliwatt of drive for 50 watts output. The Spectrian, I guess they're like $250 or $300. And they require a little bit of fiddling with power supplies. You've got to supply 28 volts at 50 amps, or maybe a little more to get those to honk up right. The Avantec, we call them a railroad amp. They originally went in railroad cars. If you strip all the crap off them and cut down the heat sink, they're a 13.8 volt unit. And they put out 10 real watts at 5760. That 8-watt down east microwave thing is probably a number of hundreds of dollars. I haven't been able to scrounge up anything more than a watt. Occasionally you see them. You'll see 5 watters commonly, not 8 watters. They work pretty well. And on 24 gigahertz, that you shouldn't think about until you know something about the microwaves, because it's tough even to integrate that and get it to work right. But DB6NT, again, for a lot of money, I don't know how much it is, several $100s, maybe $1,000, will sell you 4 watts there. Or you can get lucky like I did. There was a microwave engineer who had a small number of 4-watt units that are probably better than the DB6NT, and I won't tell you what I paid for it. It was more money than I should have, considering that I don't have anything that works on 24 gigs, but I did it. And where do you get the amplifiers? Well, if you just want to buy, K1FO makes just gorgeous stuff. He'll sell you a power supply. One power supply is enough, since you're not going to run these rigs more than one at a time. And they're pairs of 3CX800s. And they're reasonably priced. So, inside the station, there are always accoutrements. There's an SO3R box. Well, that's, you're on your own. You've got to do your own, build your own integration box. It's not dreadfully difficult. And I suppose if you've got lots of money, the WX0B could build you a real nice one if you are confident enough to tell him exactly what it's going to do and what it hooks up to. He builds very nice HF stuff, and none of this is VHF or microwave stuff for the most part. The mother of all switching units usually goes inside that box. You want a high-quality pan adapter? Well, there are a variety of ways you can do this. There's a thing called an LP pan. If you have something like an SDR 5000, the Flex radio box, that has pan adapter built into it. I don't like to tune with a mouse, but I will tell you, having fired up the skimmer soon after it came out, you can learn to love the mouse, especially on a band where you don't have to move very fast. You want digital readout rotors? I like Mike Stahl's Orion 2800. You can either use his box or you can buy it without the box. He'll sell it to you without the box and get Green Heron controllers. You want to lock your local oscillators. This will cost you, unless you're a real scrounger, $500. But it'll lock everything from 2.3 and up. And these others at 903 and 1296 are probably minor, will read out within 500 hertz. That's close enough. But 2304 and up, sitting out in the elements, be nice to have the GPS locking. You're going to run WSJT. You don't need a real fancy computer. An ordinary computer will do, but fancy computers are so cheap. For less than $1,000, you can get 2 monitors, a 2-monitor support, 4 gigs of RAM, and a multi-core Pentium. You need a fancy audio card if you don't have the SDR 5000 in order to see 192 kilohertz of spectrum at a time. And the various types of software, including MAP65, which is a digital skimmer for EME, and the various types of SDR software. Now, antennas I'll go through rather quickly because these are all commercial. I'm going to use directive systems antennas. You can get equivalent antennas from Mike Stahl. The reason that I didn't go I didn't use his antennas for everything, is that Directive Systems sells 903 and 1296 Yagis, loop Yagis. I like loop Yagis because they're easy to feed. Mike Stahl does sell CNC generated 903 and 1296 linear Yagis. Look like a regular Yagi, but they're cut by a machine. And I've never used them. I assume if he sells them, they must work. But I still like the loop Yagis, personally. So that's what you see here. And look at the chintzy towers. A single 70-foot tower makes you so loud that you'll boil the paint off somebody's front end on 6 meters. 17-foot boom antennas, 4 of them stacked, and they rotate in pairs. The top pair is at the top of the tower and rotate. The bottom pair is on a ring rotor. In fact, if you don't care about losing 60 or 70 degrees of rotation, you can even rotate them with a gate and a regular old rotator, something like the W9IIX system or a homebrew version of it. There's a 110-foot tower for 2 meters. Along the sides, you put up small boom 5-element. They're called LVAs for a large vertical array that Directive Systems sells. And Mike doesn't really have an equivalent antenna. You start them at 44 feet, you go up to 100 feet. And at the top you put a couple of K1FO designed FO12s. They're 17-foot boom antennas at 110 and 122 feet. And how many of these LVA, 8 Yagi LVAs, if you've got 2 or 3 directions where there's a lot of activity, you put up 2 or 3 of them. None of it's cheap, but it works. For 432 and 222, you can put up an H-frame with a pair of Yagis on one side for 222 and a pair for 432. And above that, you can stack pairs of loop Yagis. So it's 2 H-frames, one stacked above another. But the spacing isn't very great. It doesn't worry you. And a 4th tower, an 80-foot tower, probably a pretty hefty tower. Roan 55, AB 105, Roan 65, some kind of surplus broadcast tower, because for the microwaves you want 2 dishes, and that's a lot of wind area. A 6-foot dish is 3 squared, or 9 times 3.1416. So that dish alone, the 6-foot dish, is 27 square feet. A 4-foot dish is 4 times 3, or 12 square feet more. So you've got 40 square feet of antenna sitting on the tower. If you're on top of a mountain, it gets loaded up with 6 inches of radial ice. You better have a good tower, or your tower will soon be QRT from that location. And what about the feed lines? Well, you can see I like heliacs. Big heliacs for 903 and 2304. And the drip loops all out of this foam coax. So VHF is a new horizon, and the contest can be a lot of fun. I will tell you that if you have a good band opening in a VHF contest, it's as exciting as anything you've ever worked on HF. At its best, 6 meters is like 10 meters in a domestic contest. And there's always the occasional piece of DX thrown in. I do quite a bit of microwave operating because KHEP has a lot of superb operators. They like and can do 6 and 2. They can't do the microwaves. They don't know the stations. They don't know where they are. I don't have to look them up. I know where they are. If they're close enough for me to work them, I know what direction they're in. And you make a contact more than 100 miles away, I still think it's a magic show. The problem is it's a magic show that's running at the cutting edge of technology. And so just to keep it going, reliability is a big problem. So people say, what should I say about this? Compete with yourself. You don't have any microwave bands? Compete against yourself. Compete against people who have the same bands you do. Every time try to do better than you did the time before. And if you don't have everything, just enjoy the things that you do have. If you download this, you'll see a whole bunch of bibliography things. And you can, I'm not going to go through these. I do at one point describe the KHEP system, which until 2 years ago operated completely out of school buses. The exciting thing there was school bus. Getting the school bus that's designed to run on flat ground up 10% grades is very exciting, especially when they overheat, their brakes fail, their power steering fails, and you have to go to a chainsaw place that does farm equipment. And when you see the place, it looks sort of like, you know, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So we've had our fun with that. More fun than actually working the contest. Contesting is now an integration between man and machine, so that June 2008 certainly has the best title of anything I'll ever write. The Contester is Cyborg and the Rise of the Machines. It's an interesting column. And that's it. So I am going to ask Ken to take it back from me.
Okay, Gene, very good. Why don't you can put your slides up there in case you need to go back to one during the question session here, but good stuff. Okay, question time. Let's try to get a few in here before we wrap things up. Once again, you have a little questions box on your control panel there. If you type in a question, please make sure you hit send, otherwise we'll never see it. Or you have the option, if you have a microphone connected and you want to talk to us directly, go ahead and click on the hand icon to raise your hand, and we will go ahead and get you connected there. So, Gene, let's see here. I got to go scroll through the list. Joel W3ZZ has had his hand up for a bit, so his arm must be getting tired. Let's try to get him on here with us. And let's see if I can get this to take. There he is. Joel, go ahead.
Oh, that was a mistake. Sorry.
Okay. Well, your microphone works.
Good presentation, Gene.
Well, thank you, Joel. And by the way, you were in the original version. It isn't because I knew you were going to come here tonight.
Okay. Yeah, I clicked the button by error. Sorry about that.
No problem. Okay. We have some questions coming up here, too. Just stand by. Okay, first one here, Gene. Dave asks, and this is a kind of an interesting question for me, too, since I'm moving to a new house and going to be redoing a station. Has anyone ever won ARRL VHF with just the bottom 4 bands and 150 watts or less?
You don't compete at 150 watts. You don't compete against the high-powered stations. The answer is, well, K1JX won the QRP. That's the portable category. I think he had either had 903 and 1296 also, or just 1296, and he won by a huge margin. His score held up for many, many years until Zach Lau, who works at the ARRL lab and is a real microwave, I mean, he's a real primary microwave designer, went up to probably Mount Equinox in Vermont and had a lot of microwave contacts and eventually beat him. But several years later. The answer is that I think that K2DRH may have won it with just the bottom 4 bands. Now that's a huge station. He has high power capabilities, but he normally operates the ARRL low power. And on 6 and 2 meters, his station is in the same order of magnitude ballpark as the one I described in this talk. And I think he's had the highest low power score. And K2DRH is in EN42 in western Illinois. So the answer is, yeah, you could try, but it wouldn't be easy. The ARRL contests, I've tried and failed, by the way, not only in the 9 years that I've been the VHF editor, but for about 10 years before that, to convince them that it's no longer necessary to give that huge bonus for microwave contacts, because you don't have to build the stuff anymore. You can integrate your way in. And if somebody makes a contact 500 miles away on 2 meters on a relatively dead band, he gets 1 point for it. If you work someone on 2304 who's 5 miles from you, you get 4 points for that. I think that's wrong. And of course, there's a move afoot now to shift at least one of the ARRL contests to distance scoring. That's what the Europeans do. There are apparently, I don't know whether they're listening tonight, but registered, there are 2 Europeans registered for this talk. They know what VHF contesting is really all about. Years ago, and it's quite a number of years ago, it must be 10 years ago, I worked 40 meters at W3LPLs with G4PIQ, who is the VHF editor for the RSGB. And I asked him about that. I said, what's it like to work a VHF contest? He said, well, the VHF field day, which is our 4th of July field day, he said the 2-meter operator, if he doesn't average 200 an hour for the first 2 hours, he goes out and falls on the ceremonial sword. It's like you died and you went to heaven. There's so much activity. It's unbelievable. In the CQ contest, somebody went to Asian Turkey. I think it was YM3HA. They were running 10 watts on 6 meters. No, 10 watts on 2 meters. And they got a 2-meter E-skip opening. And they worked 800 stations on 2 meters with 10 watts. Well, you tell me that happens. I've worked E-skip during a contest, but it ain't easy. Go ahead.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions here. Let's try to get a few more in before we wrap it up. Multi-op question. Do you have internal RFI problems at KHEP between 6 meters and the higher bands? And if so, how do you deal with it?
We have some cross-station interference. And it's like the cannibal and the alligator going across the raft with missionary. You have to set up the antennas so they normally don't point at each other. And at KHEP, when we operated from Spruce, we did that. Now the antennas are further apart, and we haven't had much trouble since we moved to our new fixed location. Of course, the antennas don't work very well yet, but eventually they will. You do use filters. You can use low-pass filters in front of the transmitters. You use band-pass filters in front of the receivers. And you want to use bulletproof receiver. If you have a K3, a lot of your problems go away. I assume that, you could use some other things as an RF strip like an IC 7800, which would do pretty well. But since we went to the K3s, all the problems have gone away, which leads me to believe that a lot of the interference problems we had were just that those TS-850s were good, but just not good enough.
Okay, next question. Can you discuss how operating SO2R on 6 and 2 meters might work? And that comes from Les N1 Lima Fox.
How would you do that? Well, I don't know what you mean by network. You have an SO2R box that feeds, so that you can select with one switch which exciter you use. Do you use K3 number 1 or do you use K3 number 2? And you also have CQ machines, obviously. So let's say you're talking sideband. You turn on the sideband CQ on 6 meters, and while it's calling CQ, and you have maybe a 30-second CQ because things are slow, you're tuning around. You have 30 seconds to tune around and see if there's anybody on 2 meters. You don't hear anybody on 6. Now you call CQ on 2 meters. You flip the switch, your microphone and your parrot or whatever you're using, your sound card, calls CQ on 2 meters. And you go back and forth. It's the same thing that you do on HF, except it's a lot easier because you're not always worrying about working someone. You could go 3-4 minutes and not work someone on a band with CQs. It gives you a lot of time to find someone on another band.
Yeah, one of these times I'd like to have a good presentation on SO2R. I know there's a lot of good articles about it as well. So
yeah, I'd like to do it too. I was, as you know, an observer for down in
Barbados.
Right. For 8P5A, and I know that he's a good SO2R operator, but his rates were so high, he did almost none of it. Couldn't.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You're working 250 guys an hour. You just don't have time to look on the other receiver. He's human and he's honest. Okay, I won't go any further.
Okay, we have Ken with his hand raised. Let's see if we can get him on with us here. Ken, are you with us? Okay, I'm not hearing him. I think it's KA2LIM. Ken, are you there?
Hello, Ken.
Okay, that's not working. So check
now,
his microphone. We'll try again. Yes, sir.
KA2LIM is an example of a guy who turns in very nice scores, and he lives just south of Rochester in a place where there's a fair amount of local activity there. But boy, if you want to work him, you got to go through mountains, even though he's pretty high. That doesn't help you. When I look up towards him, I've got to go through the first ridge of the Blue Ridge. And it's not trivial to get into him, and yet I do, and I work him in most contests.
Okay, we got a few more questions here. Let's try to get through these. Is there anything you would like to see rovers do that would help out the fixed stations more than what they already do? And this comes from KK6 Mike Charlie Stroke R.
Yes. Hello, Mr. Duffy. The ostensible reason for having rovers is not to help other rovers, but to help fixed stations. And I always point to Gene, N0DQS, who roves, he's out in western Iowa. He works KM0T.
Okay, you still there, Gene? Or?
Of 4 or 5 stations, and he'll go from, he's the reverse of grid circling. He's grid circling for fixed stations. He'll pick up 4 or 5 of them, and he'll work them all the way up, all the bands that they can work in one grid. He'll move to another grid, and he'll do it over again, and all working around a grid corner. Their grid corner is the intersection of 2 roads. It's a lot nicer than grid corners around here, where you have to go off into a farmer's field or worse. I don't know if they could do any more than they do, but I don't frankly see, you know, I guess whatever floats your boat, the guys who grid circle and work nothing but each other, hey, if that's what turns you on, that's fine. But I don't see how they give anything back to the contest except to themselves. Whereas a rover goes out, he supplies not only cues but multipliers to people. And the rovers around here in the east all work everybody else with one exception, which I won't go into here.
Well, David has a question in that regard. As a rover, he says, how can you get someone to turn their antennas towards you? A lot of times he'll hear stations calling and calling, but when he tries to answer them, they never hear him.
Well, that's, of course, the big problem, but that's why VHF people like schedules. They like to call each other on their cell phones. They like chat nets. They like all the things that would get their house burned down if they were HF guys. And that's because it's really difficult. You know, everything is difficult. On HF, you got huge pileups. You can't get through them. Propagation doesn't favor you, and there's 10,000 guys calling that VY. But on VHF, the problem is attracting people's attention. Part of it is the guy at the other end should be moving his antenna around. And I'm sure there are a lot of people call me and I don't hear them. I will say this, I have pretty good ears, and I'll very often know someone's calling me, but sometimes I never find them. And there's not very much that you can do about that. It's the nature of these narrow, clean patterns that VHF antennas have. But if you are a home station, especially one with a pretty good signal, it's incumbent on you to keep moving your antenna around. You leave it in one place, there's all kinds of people who are going to miss you. Plus, you're going to get a reputation. The rover is going to go out to a grid where he could easily work you. He's going to hear you, he's going to call you and call you and call you, and you're never going to come back, and he's going to say, you know, not worth calling that guy. He's deaf. He doesn't pay attention. Well, that's all I can say is home stations, you got to move. You got to move around, and sometimes it's luck. Somebody shows up from a distant grid in the direction that you're looking, and that's great. I like to ray. If I get somebody out in Ohio, I hold them up for an extra transmission in hopes that one of their friends will hear that they're working somebody in Washington, D.C., and that their friends will look. But sometimes you just can't do it.
Here's someone that knows a bit or two about SO2R. Ty, K3MM says, I think it's more difficult to do SO2R on VHF because the signals are typically much weaker and you can't really split the receive audio between headphones without suffering from the increased noise floor between your ears. All right. Question from us.
I don't disagree that it may not be easy to do, but certainly you can spend most of your time on 6 meters. and not miss any of the openings if you have SO2R. Even if you don't use it the way a pure SO2R guy does, at least you're there. You're listening on 6 meters every 5 or 10 minutes. The openings are not going to get away from you so easily.
Okay, Les asks, do you make many contacts on FM during contests? What do you think about making an effort to monitor FM more in order to increase your score?
Well, there was a time more than 10 years ago when there was some FM activity. That activity has dried up as the repeaters have dropped dead. And why have they dropped dead? It took me a while to figure that out. Most people use the repeaters like a cell phone. When cell phones became cheap, they didn't have to talk to their wife on the repeater. They could talk to their wife on a cell phone. And so the cell phones in the Washington, D.C. area are cell phones. The repeaters in the Washington, D.C. area on FM are essentially devoid of activity. There's just nobody on. The biggest club in the Washington area, the NVFMA, at one time in the early part of this decade, had 800 members. 4 years ago, I gave a talk to them, and like about 35, 40 people showed up. And the president was just beside himself. He was so happy. He says, you know, we only have 80 people left. Well, they're just going. I haven't even put an FM box in my car. I have a perfectly good FT1000 or FT100, and it's a great FM box actually once you program it. But there's nobody to talk to, so I don't talk. The new location that KHEP has is absolutely the best FM location that ever lived. You can stand with an HT in his front yard and talk to people on the other side of the Chesapeake Bay, full quieting with an HT. Rubber duck to rubber duck. And I don't know, ask Ty, K3MM. He's the one who's supposed to work FM. I know that he never gets terribly excited about it, but we haven't been able to generate any kind of activity. Maybe there is some in some places. They say Rochester has a lot of it, but not around here.
Let's try to get Michael in here, who has his hand raised. And Michael, go ahead.
Hey, Gene. Nice seminar there. Just asking, what's the difference between using transverters and then using radios that actually have, like multiband radios, like the FT857 IC7000. What's your thoughts on the difference between the two?
Mike, what's your call?
It's a KC2PLJ. I'm a rover station.
That's right, you are. And I think an FN22 rover sometimes, yes?
Yes, I am. I've actually worked you, I think, in a couple
yeah, no, I've actually worked you. Yeah, see, you'll notice I asked, as soon as I heard his call, I knew why I have to know him. Because you don't work him, you don't work FM22. And it isn't always easy to work a rover. I don't know where he operates from in that grid.
All over the place.
But he has pretty decent, now FN22 is about 25 degrees north of where I normally look. And so I have to keep my antenna moving or I'm going to miss him. Mike, the multiband, the small multiband rigs like the IC7000 are not even in the same room with a transverter ahead of a good IF strip. And by good IF strip, even something like a TS850, which is not modern and not new, with a good transverter in front of it, works very, very well. The IC7000, if you were to use it and you were to live within 30 miles of me, I'll destroy that radio. Even when I'm not looking at you, you won't be able to hear anything. You'll just hear garbage all over the band. And it's not me, because I do have a K1RZ who finishes sometimes first and usually second or third, no worse than third anymore, in the VHF contest. He's 9.9 miles from me. He runs 1,500 watts. I run 1,500 watts. Now, we normally don't look at one another unless I'm looking up towards Rochester, in which case I look right over him. But within 10 kilohertz of him, I don't know he's there. He doesn't know I'm there. And generally what I do is I sit down around 190. He sits up around 208. And it's completely, it's probably bad news for people with an IC 7000 or an IC 706 or an 857, because we're probably really doing a number on them. But the reason you use transverters is because they are not only sensitive, these other radios are sensitive enough to do almost everything you need. They just can't handle, you're talking about a receiver that has an overload less than 80 dB versus a receiving system with a transverter and a good IF strip that is approaching 100 dB. That's a huge difference.
Thank you very much, Gene. My question was I will be able to use the same functions on my FT950 or my Kenwood HF radio as far as the receiver goes as I would be able to use on my dedicated radio for
Well, what kind of functions can't you use?
Well, for instance,
what do you need in the 7000 except FM?
Well, what I'm asking is the receiver in the 950 is much better as far as I'm concerned than let's say the FT857 or the 706.
Right. It is.
So that's what I'm asking. I'm asking I can use those functions in the excellent receiver and get the same results.
Yes, anything that the 950 can do. That's all the transverter does, is let you listen to a VHF band. All the tricks that you can play with your fancy HF receiver are still usable. And the 950 is a good radio.
Okay, you answered my question, Gene. I appreciate it, and I also appreciate your comments and the seminar you provided. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Michael. We have a couple of good questions here yet, but we've kind of run long. So what I would suggest is, Gene, I would imagine you'd be happy to take some questions via email for those that maybe didn't get their question answered here. Gene's address is on qrz.com. Is that maybe the best way to get a hold of you, Gene?
Well, the best way to get me is to use the ARRL address, W3 Zulu Zulu ZZ at ARRL.org.
Okay, so those of you, I apologize, we didn't get to your questions, but we need to wrap this up. So go ahead and shoot Gene an email, and I'm sure he'd be happy to answer that. So anything else, Gene, before we wrap this up?
No, I don't have anything. Thank you all for coming and for staying awake.
Okay, just a couple of things I wanted to hit on here quick, and that is that we have another presentation coming up on June 7th. This is more for the HF types with Dean Straw N6BV on the tactical use of propagation predictions. And you can register for that on the PVRC webpage at www.pvrc.org and then clicking on the upcoming webinars link. Again, this event has been recorded and that will also be up on the PVRC webpage, so go ahead and pass the word if you would. Gene, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to do this excellent presentation. I'm glad we were able to kind of broaden our coverage of contesting topics hitting VHF tonight, and I'd like to do it again sometime, make sure we engage the VHF crowd. So for those of you that have attended, If you have any other VHF related topics you'd like to see or whatever, just feel free to drop me an email, and we'll see what we can do to accommodate that. So, Gene, thank you very much. Appreciate you doing this for us, and we'll look forward to doing it again maybe another time.
Okay, thank you very much, Ken. Good luck. All.
Okay, thanks everyone for attending. Have a great evening. So long. Bye-bye.